You can tell I'm from out of town. I don't know exactly, when things may happen, but we'll get there. And I've done a lot of weddings as a minister, and I always tell the people that are getting married, if some little thing happens, that'll be the thing you remember, and that'll be the thing you treasure. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. I live in Temple, but I watch you guys on my computer every week. And I know that Reverend Anna likes to start with an affirmation. So I brought one with me all the way from Temple. We'll see if it works. God is your sufficiency in all things. If you all will say that with me 3 times. God is your sufficiency in all things. God is your sufficiency in all things. God is my sufficiency in all things. Here's something else she does. Now you got to turn to somebody near you. You have to say it to them, either behind you or in front of you. Find somebody to say, God is your sufficiency in all things. Well, what is it that is your sufficiency in all things? It's God's grace. And we're going to talk today about grace. And we're going to talk today about sufficiency. In the Bible, grace is mentioned 159 times. Sufficiency is mentioned also, but you don't hear as much about that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Because when we understand what sufficiency means, it can change our lives for the better. Generally, when you talk about sufficiency, you're thinking about, well, does that mean money? Does that mean health? What does that mean? It means everything, because God's grace is our sufficiency. Most of the time, people come to God when things have gone wrong, and they need help, and that's fine. They need somebody to help them in whatever they may be going through. Well, I went through something last year. In February of last year, I lost my wife, Jan. We had been married for 23 years, but we knew each other for 37 years. And not only did we have a long marriage and a long relationship, but the last 5 years of the marriage, I was her 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week caregiver. So when I lost her, the relationship, I also lost my job as her caregiver. So it was a rough time. And I'm sure everybody here has been a caregiver. I'm sure everybody here has probably lost something or somebody along the way. But the journey is really an interesting journey, and it's different for everybody. And what I did is Carol mentioned, I wrote a book about it. And the name of the book is The Forever Penny. Now, her name was not Penny, it was Jan. But the day after she passed, beginning then, 2 or 3 times a week, I will find pennies in the strangest places. I'll find them on the street, I'll find them in the house, I'll find them in the car. And I think that's Jan's way of saying, hey, I'm still here. I'm still here, baby. Every time you find a penny, that's me letting you know that. So today after the service, I'll be signing books out there. And I've done this kind of an interesting way. It specifically talks about the first 6 months after she passed. She died on February 28th, 2017. And so it details, we were living in Minneapolis, but she always said, if I go first, I want you to go back to Texas, because I know how much you love it. It only took me a month. I came on home. And this is the story of that journey from then until the first 6 months was ended. So the Forever Penny, I know when I went to grief groups, people who were there would say, I think my loved one's still trying to connect with me. I see birds, I see hummingbirds, I see animals, and I really believe that our loved ones are never far away from us. And boy, that gave me a lot of peace of mind to know that. Well, when I was going through the first couple of months, I did a lot of reading. I read from the Bible and did other reading from authors that I had around the apartment. But one day I went to Target looking for something else to maybe help me out. And you won't believe the book that just jumped off the shelf and into my red cart. You'd never guess this in a million years. But this book said, I want you to buy me. So I did it. This is a book about somebody that was at the top of his profession at one time. He was a football player. He won the Heisman Trophy. He was a major quarterback in college. But then he went to the pros, and every team that he tried out with cut him. And all of a sudden, all these people that had been banging on his door and calling him and telling him how great he was, they were nowhere to be found. And so he wrote a book, and it's called Subhead, Discovering Your True Identity in the Midst of Life's Storms. And the name of the book is Shaken, and it's by Tim Tebow. Now, there's probably someone here today that may be going through something. They may be trying to deal with a loss or whatever, but I can tell you this book will help you. Is there anybody here that is going through anything? Well, the first one that speaks up is going to get this copy. There you go. Are you a football fan? Oh, okay. That will help. That will help. When we talk about sufficiency, and I mentioned, you go to God usually when things are tough. But I've got a little bit different take on it today, and I want to just kind of put this out here to you. Sometimes I think when we need God's sufficiency the most is when we are on the top, when we're on the top of the mountain. Maybe you just gotten a big promotion. Maybe you bought Amazon stock back when it was $1 a share. So now all of a sudden everything's going great. Your phone's ringing all the time. And now with all this money, you probably bought a new condo or new house, new car. And so there's a tendency, and I'm pretty sure this is true of everybody, that when things are going great, you tend to think, I did it. I worked hard. I knew what I was doing with my investments. And God, I've got this. I've got this thing. If you got a 911 call from somebody else that really needs you, you take that because I'm great. I'm good. And I think it's just at that moment when that happens, when you think you got it all together, but you don't need God that much, that is the time more than ever you need to touch base, connect, and look to God for the sufficiency that you need. This past week we had 2 suicides of very famous people. Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. These people were wealthy. They had prominence. And you would think, well, my gosh, they had everything. But the truth is, you never know what's going on inside somebody. They can be smiling, oh yeah, everything's wonderful and all that, but you don't know what they may be carrying around. And that is why God's sufficiency, God's grace, is so important at all times in our lives. And to be able to do that is so crucial. Now here's a twist, something that I thought about in preparing this talk. What does it mean, sufficiency? Does it mean today, tomorrow, next week? What does it mean, really? And what does it mean as far as what I want and what God wants to give me in God's grace? And I really think it boils down to this. Sufficiency and grace is for this moment. Not for next week, not for yesterday, sure, but for this moment. Think about it. Think about the breath of life. You already breathed the oxygen that you needed to get through yesterday. It's too early to breathe it for tomorrow because they couldn't store it. God gives you the breath for right now. Now, what does that mean as far as sufficiency? Like, well, if you have to pay the rent, God's grace will give you the sufficiency to do it if it's due today, or maybe tomorrow or the next day. But you'll get what you need when you need it. But it deals in grace and sufficiency, deal in exactly what is happening with you right this moment. If you think about it, I think you'll think about times that's happened to you. And I think about some times in my life that God gave me the grace I needed right at that second. I remember several years ago, I lived in Dallas about 30 years. And you all know about the traffic in Dallas? Almost as bad as Austin. Pretty bad. One day I was driving on Dallas North Tollway. This is about 20 years ago. And I was just tooling along. And all of a sudden I heard this voice. I swear, I heard this voice. And here's what the voice said. You are protected. Not 1 second later, I heard this crash. And I looked in the rearview mirror, about a quarter mile behind me, these two cars, one car had veered over to the other lane, and they hit. And they, came off on the side of the road. Well, I pulled over too to be sure everybody was okay, and the two drivers got out. So it was not really a serious accident. But where did that voice come from? At that instant, that said, you are protected. I don't know. But then 1 second later, to hear that crash in the background. Another time in Minneapolis, where I lived for about 15 years, I was on I-35. It goes that far up, driving to downtown Minneapolis. And I was just driving along very peacefully, and all of a sudden there's a huge crash on my car. And what had happened, they were working on a bridge above I-35 and had dislodged a boulder, piece of concrete. That piece of concrete hit the very top of my car. If I had been 1 second, 2 seconds earlier, it would have gone straight through my windshield. God's grace was my sufficiency at that time. I was in the corporate world at 7-Eleven for a long time, and we traveled with company planes, so we went different places. And one day we were flying from Dallas to Los Angeles. And there were 4 people on the plane, 4 South 7-Eleven executives. One of them was the president of the company, Jerry Thompson. And Jerry and I were sitting facing the back of the plane, and these 2 other fellows were sitting facing us. And we'd been about, maybe an hour and a half out of Dallas, and we were all just talking along. And all of a sudden, these 2 guys that were facing Jerry and me just got this look of horror on their face. I mean, it was like, well, right away, we knew something probably wrong. So we looked back of us, and there was smoke pouring out of the cockpit. And the door was open, and the co-pilot was standing there, standing up in the cockpit. And he had a towel, and he was trying to stop this smoke. And I'll never forget what Jerry Thompson did. This is leadership in action. There was just 1 second that passed, and then Jerry stood up and said, I think I'll have a beer. I've never forgotten that. And he said, would anybody else like one? Oh, yeah. We all 3 raised our hands. He went straight to the back of the plane, fetched 4 beers, came back, and we all took a beer, and were just there drinking like nothing was going on. And then the co-pilot came back and said, well, we got a little fire. Yeah, we could tell that. And there had been a short in the cockpit above where the pilots sit. And he said, we've got to land. He said, we don't know exactly how bad it is, but we've got to take this thing down. He said, the only problem is it's 20 minutes to the nearest airport. Well, I can tell you, that was the longest 20 minutes in my life. And yeah, we were sure that beer helped. It really did. But we were all, you could tell we were all praying, all concerned. And when we got on the ground, they said, well, it is bad. You can't go any further in this airplane. We've got to get you another one. At that moment, I can tell you, that God's grace was my sufficiency. Not only with getting us down without a problem, but we got to have a beer along with it. Can't beat that. There have been other times too. I'll tell you a couple of quick stories. 3 months ago, I had a physical, and I've always had borderline diabetes. And so the doctor said, well, your A1C, you all know what that is, has spiked to 7.4. So you need to start doing something. So he prescribed some medication and talks about diet, exercise, and all that. And so I turned it over to God and really started praying about it and doing everything I could from a spiritual standpoint. I went back this past week, it was 6.4. And he said, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. And I know that God's grace was my sufficiency. Well, something happened today I've got to tell you about. I'm staying in your apartment above the office here. And so Reverend Anna left me the keys to the office and on a little keychain. And so when I got packed up and ready to go today after the service, I couldn't find it. I couldn't find those keys. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, she'll never invite me back. I've lost the keys to the office. And so I started thinking, I'm sure you've done this too, like where have I been that I might have lost those keys? Well, I gassed up at 7-Eleven yesterday. And so the day before church, I went over to 7-Eleven and I didn't expect anything. But I asked the young lady that was there, I said, did anybody turn in any keys? And she said, yeah, matter of fact, they did. She said, we have them up here at the cash register. It were the keys. And she said, you know how often that happens? First of all, that somebody brings keys in that they find. And second of all, nobody ever comes back for them. And there they were. And so, Reverend Anna, if you're watching, I've got your keys. I'm sure you have stories where God's grace was your sufficiency at every moment when things happen. And you know, I think about God's grace that affected not only me, but I think about this person. She was born in a little town in Minnesota. And when she was very young, her dad went away for World War II. He fought in World War II. He was gone for 4 years. When he came back from the war, she was only 5 years old. She barely even remembered anything about him. But anyway, she had 2 brothers, she had a sister, and then her mother and dad. They moved to Duluth, where it was kind of the big city around there, Lake Superior. And in 1950, when she was 8 years old, her brother was 14. And one day he went out to swim in Lake Superior. He didn't come back. He tried to swim out from shore to a buoy that was about a mile away, and he drowned. It happened to be their mother's birthday on top of that. So that was an experience that she had there. And then her dad, and this happens to a lot of veterans, the war had scarred him, and he came back, he began drinking. And in those days, they didn't have all the services for the veterans that they have now. They didn't have treatment centers and all that kind of rehab and things like that. Back then, in the 40s, late 40s, they put you in something called a sanitarium. And you stayed there until you got sober, no matter how long that was. But anyway, he finally did get sober, and so things started getting a little better. She got married right out of high school, like a lot of people do. And she and her husband started having children. They had 3 kids in the first 6 years of their marriage. And then in the 1970s, after she'd been married about 15 years, she was diagnosed with a chronic disease, the disease of lupus. 2 weeks later, her husband announced that he was leaving. So she was diagnosed with a chronic illness. He left, and she was left with custody of these 3 children. And I think the oldest one then was 14. Her child support was $450 a month. She hadn't worked since she'd been married. Man, she was up against it. She decided to go back to school. She became a licensed practical nurse, supported the kids. And her spiritual journey was, she was the person that introduced me to Unity. She sent me a copy of the Daily Word. When we were at Unity Village in about 1999, I think it was, she wrote a pamphlet about her, all of her life up till then, and the title of it was Trusting God. Because what she said, she came to a point where that was all that was left to do. That was the best-selling pamphlet that we had when I was at Unity Village. And I think you probably can guess that the person I'm talking about was my wife, Jan. She was one of the most spiritual people I've ever known. And when we did her memorial service in Minnesota, I was one of the speakers that day, and here's what I told the people. If you knew her, you knew a great person. You know, in our lives, we're blessed to know a lot of people. But if you can know somebody and you can truly say they're great, that's really something. And also what I realized then, in losing her and the aftermath and all that, is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, maybe long after you've departed this world, your name's going to come up. Somebody is going to say, you know, I remember so-and-so. Now, hopefully what they're going to say is, boy, what a great person that was. It won't be like the Dixie Chicks song, you know, about Earl. It said, spring turned into summer, summer turned into fall, and Earl turned out to be a missing person that nobody missed at all. I think when we think about what does our life mean, it will mean something. It will mean it will touch. Your life is going to touch, if it hasn't already, in the future, your life is going to touch someone. And if you come across as a person surrounded by God's grace, you're going to be well remembered. They're going to be happy that they knew you. And I'm sure that'll be true of all the people here today. Well, I want to tell you just a couple more quick things about grace. There are 3 things about grace for sure. And here they are. Grace is personal. God's grace is not for anybody else. The specific grace that you have coming to you, it wouldn't work for anybody else. Especially for you. God knows your needs. God knows what you need in your life. And God will provide it. The second thing about grace is it's not a one-time deal. You know, you might tend to think, God, that was great you found those keys today. Now what's going to happen next? It's not a one-time deal. God's grace is coming at us all the time. It always comes with benefits. That's the third thing. Whenever you get showered with God's grace, you're getting showered with something positive in your life. Grace is always good. There's no bad grace. And here's one last thing when you think about grace. I love acronyms. So here's my GRACE acronym for grace. First is G means good. God is good all the time. The R stands for ready. You got to be ready to receive grace. You got to be ready to know it's coming and be set to receive it when it does come. The A means always. God's grace is always present in our lives. The C means choice. You have a choice. You have free will choice. You can accept God's grace or not accept it. It's up to you. But when you don't accept it, maybe you don't fully understand what the benefit may seem to be at the time, but you do have the choice not to take it. E means eternal. I believe that God's relationship to us is eternal. It's always here. We're always connected. The Daily Word today talked about consciousness. We all carry our consciousness with us. And when we have a consciousness of God, then we're going to have a positive life for sure. So E means eternal. God's relationship with us is eternal. I know one of the first things I remember they taught us up at Unity at school is God will never leave you, God will never forsake you. And there are times you may feel like, God, where are you? I thought you were here all the time. God is. God is eternal. The love of God belongs to each one of us eternally. So Grace. That's your sufficiency. That's my sufficiency. And it will be our sufficiency until the end of time. So thank you and God bless you.
When you walk through the storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm, it's the goal.